we give the floor to Jeffrey Sachs, that chair the first roundtable.
Thank you very much, and it's really wonderful that we're assembled here on this important topic, and I want to start by saying how much we all admire the report of the high-level panel on humanitarian financing. It's a wonderful, wonderful report, and we stand strongly behind it. One of the most important messages, I believe, of the report is the opening, which is that the way to address humanitarian crises most urgently is to prevent them from happening. And I think there is a certain sense in which we cannot keep up with the present trends, no matter what the generosity might be, if these wars that are spreading are not brought to an end. The humanitarian response is bound to be deficient. I wanted to say before introducing the panel a few words about these crises, because I think it's important to understand the very peculiar, extraordinarily dangerous nature of these crises, especially in Syria, but across a wide region that includes Iraq, Syria, now much of North Africa, Libya certainly, Afghanistan still. And I think there are a few characteristics that are important for us to keep in mind. These regions are now beset by private armies and by private gangs. What we're seeing is a tremendous dissipation of organized armies into extraordinarily violent smaller units. And we basically have gang warfare over thousands of miles now. And they are as destructive and merciless as one could imagine. Of course, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and many others. I think it's extremely important to understand that these gangs have been created by state powers. These are not simply the arrival of gangs from below, like the gangs of Los Angeles. These are state-constructed powers. This is hidden from view, but it's extremely important to understand if we want to understand this reality. Remember, the Mujahideen was created by the US government consciously in Afghanistan in 1979, recruiting Osama bin Laden and others for the purpose of US attack on the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. And so this was creating mercenary units that have continued to grow for the last 40 years. We deny most of this. In the newspapers, these just show up as horrible gangs. We learn their names one year to the next. Who knew ISIS till a year ago? Who knew Al-Nusra? Who knew Al-Qaeda 5 years ago? But these are constructed units. So we're talking about proxy wars using incredibly violent mercenary paramilitaries. And this is not beyond our control. This is a matter of geopolitics more than human fate or out of control local action. It's murky, of course, because none of the financial support is published. But once in a while, like we had 3 weeks ago, we had a story in the New York Times about the US and Saudi Arabia in a secret order of President Obama funding the war in Syria. And a lot of this is funding these kinds of irregular forces. We know that Qatar has funded essentially the Al-Qaeda in Syria. This is al-Nusra. We know that Turkey and Saudi Arabia have put in huge amounts of money into these paramilitaries. So we have an extraordinary amount of violence with money coming from organized sources. We should not think of this as uncontrolled upheaval from below. We should understand this as part of geopolitics. But it's hidden because this is Machiavellian politics. This is trying to achieve objectives in a hidden way. That's why the president gives secret orders to the CIA rather than telling the American people what we're doing. What are the goals here? There are two kinds of goals. Certainly there is regional clash with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar fighting Iran for influence. So this is partly geopolitics, it's partly Shia-Sunni divide, but the fight in Syria, which is the #1 humanitarian crisis on the planet, is a regional battle that involves Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, jostling for power to the point of destroying a country to see who can gain more influence and determine the government. The United States is a major party to this. It's a major party to this because it has other interests. The US interest has been to keep Russian influence out of the region. And so the US has targeted every Russian ally in the last 20 years, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, because this is American geopolitics. And since Iran and the Soviet Union or Russia are allies, this means that the US also fights against Iran together with Saudi Arabia and Turkey and other Gulf states. So we have a geopolitical situation which is risking the whole world. But it is hidden to an important extent because no country describes its motives honestly. The US claimed that its intervention in Syria was to protect civilians. Well, if you wanted to protect civilians, I can't think of a worse way to do it than what they have done. Because now there are 400,000 dead and 10 million displaced. I don't think anybody cared about protecting civilians for one moment. They cared about overthrowing Assad because that was a geopolitical objective. I don't think the civilians entered into this calculation for one moment. But that's the public description. So I just feel that we need to understand the real circumstances that we're in because we have the US, Saudi Arabia, Russia on its side, Turkey, others have created the most violent gangs that roam and destroy societies. They are armed to the teeth, which you can't be armed to the teeth unless you're getting weapons from the major powers. These are heavy weapons. These are not bought on the black market. These are channeled by the CIA and by others. They were run from from Libya to Syria. We know that from tremendous circumstantial evidence. Unfortunately, it's all hidden. So we, as humanitarians, talk about the crisis, but we have to understand this is a constructed crisis. It is a geopolitical action where the participants have not cared at all and have not been honest at all in their public accounting. Let me put the numbers a little bit in perspective economically. What is $50 billion? one could compare that to U.S. military spending, which is $600 billion. Saudi military spending, which is $80 billion. UK and French military spending, which is about $60 billion a year. We spend almost $2 trillion on the military each year, a lot of it going into the destruction of these regions. The humanitarian response would be, of course, we wouldn't even need that if it weren't for these wars, but it's a tiny amount compared to the military spending. I really like the idea of a government tracker on who's spending, but I would say we should never think the U.S. is generous because it gives donations. If you fund the wars, you're not generous. So what we need is government tracking of who's spending on the wars, who's funding the paramilitaries, who has funded ISIS, al-Nusra, AQI, and so forth. Then if we had a table of that, then we could say, this is what you owe. And I have no doubt that such a table would show that the biggest amounts owed for humanitarian relief are the United States, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, other Gulf states, because they have funded these wars. So they should fund the result of these wars also, which is at least to a modicum, doing a protection of what they say they want to do, which is protect civilians, although I think there's zero evidence of an interest in protecting civilians, unfortunately, zero among the big powers. There is a convention on mercenaries of the UN, which is that it's illegal to fund such groups as al-Nusra. It's a convention, but the U.S. is not a signatory to it. In fact, none of the P5 countries is a signatory to it. It's quite stunning. So the U.S., China, Russia, UK, and France did not sign the mercenary convention, whereas a lot of smaller countries did. And this, I think, is a telltale sign because big powers want to use gangs. They want to use thugs. They want to use mercenaries to do their dirty dealing. And none of this is giving any solutions. It's just trying to put a context. I think this is why I really admire the opening, which is we cannot address the humanitarian crisis without stopping these wars. But the wars are hidden in their purpose, and there's so much deceit that one of the things we need to do is unpack what's really happening. The Iran-Saudi divide, the US-Russia divide, and to say we can't have peace unless these deeper divisions are addressed diplomatically rather than addressed in proxy wars on the battlefield. And unless we're able to do that, I'm afraid we will never be able to catch up on this. Well, those are just a few thoughts of my own on this, and I'd like to turn to the panel because we have an absolutely outstanding, remarkable panel.